Hi, my name is J Patterson, and this is a lecture introducing people to CSS. It's part one of two parts of an introductory lecture to this part of website design. The key points that I want to try and communicate over the course of this lecture is that cascading style sheets are used to format or style HTML documents. CSS itself is a language that identifies parts of the HTML tree and then describes how those parts should look. A website or a web application really consists of three different languages that work together in order to create an effect of interactive web experience. There are three concerns. We have a content concern, a presentation concern, and an interactivity concern. In previous lectures, we've described HTML, and we've talked about how the tag structure in HTML create a tree, and within each one of the tags, there could potentially be some data that we'd like to show. For example, a P tag, which means paragraph, could be used to hold the text, the first paragraph of a report or a story or an essay. That would be considered content. That's present in the document, and there's some structure to that content because a paragraph will follow another paragraph, or there'll be a headline at the beginning of the paragraph. But it doesn't really describe the presentation of the HTML. This lecture is about the presentation of that HTML. How do we take that data and give it an aesthetic, color, font, layout, etc.? We use CSS in order to do that. And the third language that we won't cover in this lecture is JavaScript, and that's used to provide interactivity to the web page, so that when you click on things and enter text into the document, you get various kinds of interactivity with the web page and perhaps with a remote server. The first thing to understand is where we should put CSS styling information. We've already seen HTML, and somehow we have to style it in a particular way. Well, there are three places we can put it. We can put it inline, we can put it internally, or we can put it externally. The external method of creating a cascading style sheet file that has all of our presentation rules in it is the best known practice. It's the preferred way to do it for a variety of reasons that we will show. However, inline and internal methods are sometimes convenient to use if you're just trying to make a particular effect in your document, or you may also encounter them in legacy applications as well. So let's take a look at how it looks in the HTML to include CSS information in each of these three different ways. And let's start with the inline method. This is a way of providing style information directly in the tags in HTML. On the left, we have some HTML with no styling, and on the right, we have HTML with inline styling. You can see in the document on the left, we start with the doc type HTML, and then an HTML tag at the top and the bottom. A child of the HTML tag is the head and the body tag, and then the body tag has an H1 tag with data. This is a heading. Down below is a rendering using the default rendering of the browser, so no styling, or what styling you get by default. Black text, pretty large for an H1, and you can see that the title tag has the title sample moved into the browser tab. Now on the right, we've included inline styling. The way that you include inline styling is any tag that you would like to style, you include an additional attribute in the HTML which has the name style. So here we see we've taken the H1 tag and we've augmented it with the style attribute. This style attribute is part of the HTML specification. So we use the equal sign and then we follow it with a string. And inside of that string is the CSS rule that should apply to this particular tag. Inside the string is a different language. It's the CSS language embedded within this document. And here we can see some suggestion that the color should be blue. So what happens in this case is that the browser, when it sees the style tag, applies the style to all of the data or all the children, anything contained within the outer H1 tags. And the way that renders in this case is the phrase, this is a heading on the left, becomes this is a blue heading on the right. We included the word blue to just demonstrate what's happening. We could do this over and over again for all the different tags in a larger document if we wanted each one of the tags to have a different kind of presentation. The second way that we can include CSS information is through an internal style sheet. This is a way of moving all of the style information from the individual tags into the head of the HTML document. And we're going to do that by using a special HTML tag that's known to the browser, which is the style tag. Here's an example of doing that. On the left, we have no styling. Same document we had before, renders the same way in the default style. But on the right, what we've done is we've brought that styling from the H1 tag up into the head. You can see that the H1 tag is exactly the same, except we added the word blue in between the H1 tags. But in the head section, we've added a style tag. And within the opening and closing style tag, we've included the text of the CSS language that describes how the H1 tag should be styled. You can see that we have H1 there, so that's some suggestion that we're linking it down to the tag. You can see that we also have the color and the blue indicators there. And some other syntax, the curly brackets and the semicolon. And you can see that when we render it, we actually get a good rendering of blue text where we expected it to be. The third and preferred way of including our styling is with an external style sheet. And what this does is, following the kind of trajectory of moving the information about styling from the individual tag level that we do when we're inline, moving it up to the head level when we're doing internal style sheet, we're actually going to remove it from the HTML document entirely and put it in a separate document called the external CSS file. If we do that, our document now looks like this. On the left side, we have the internal style sheet that I just demonstrated. We've moved the style information to the head. On the right, we've removed that style information from the head, and instead we've replaced it with this link tag. Now the link tag is also HTML, just like the style tag is. And the link tag needs to have three different attributes. It needs to have an href attribute, a type attribute, and a rel attribute. The href attribute is going to have as its value, enclosed within strings after the equal sign, an IRI, or an internationalized URL, that specifies where should we find the file that contains the CSS rules. In this case, what we see is that we're finding it in a file called style.css. Now this is a fully formed IRI, and what that means is that we could have HTTPS, we could have a different host name, we could have a path name, we could go anywhere on the internet in theory in order to get this file. If we don't include all that initial prefix information in our IRI, the host name, the protocol, etc., the assumption that the browser makes is that we're using the same information as the document in which the link tag is embedded. So if this is in an HTML document and we just say style.css, the browser is going to look for the style.css file with the same protocol, at the same host, with the same path name, basically in the same hard drive location as the HTML file, just a sibling on your hard drive for first order of approximation. What I've done on the right is I've included the body of the style.css file. You can see we've moved what was in the style tag on the left into a separate file. And there's no other text in it. It's literally just this text in the file. H1, color colon, blue, semicolon, enclosed in curly brackets. And the effect is exactly the same on the left and the right. We've kept the style rules the same. We've just moved where we've declared them from internally in the head to an external style file called style.css. Now, there are a lot of reasons why we prefer putting the style information in this external CSS file. One reason is because it really reinforces this idea that conceptually, the content and the presentation are different concerns. When we use inline styling and when we used internal style sheets, that concept is still present. It's still true that the data and the presentation are separate concerns, but they're actually both present in the same file. When we remove the CSS information into an external document, we make it very clear that the presentation is different than the data itself. HTML and CSS are actually in different files. Another reason why we like to move it into a separate file is because it's easier to collaborate with other people. You can imagine that if you had HTML files and CSS files and you had multiple people working on this site, this website, you might have one person working in the CSS and one person working in the HTML, and they could work kind of independently and not stumble on each other's edits at the same time. So that's another reason why it's helpful to have them separated. And finally, maybe the most powerful reason why it's helpful to have them separated is because this allows multiple HTML files to use the same CSS file. So imagine we were using inline styling. This means that we would have to put the style information in every single tag that we wanted to have styled in some way. When we move that information into the internal style sheet, we only have to specify it once in that file. When we move it into an external style sheet, we only have to specify the style once for an entire collection of web pages. So if you had an about page, a privacy page, an index page, and sub pages, they could all look the same using one particular external style sheet. And then later, if you want to change the aesthetic, for example, change the color scheme or change your font choices, you can just change it in one place in the CSS file. So that's all helpful for managing a larger website project. Let's look at a little more detail about the way in which the styling is applied. There's some names that we used for the different components that are part of this, this aesthetic specification. So for starters, in CSS, in inline styling, we have something called the property. Now, when we specify attributes in HTML, for example, the style attribute, what we see is it's followed by an equal sign and then information within double quotes. Well, when we specify a property in CSS, because we're using a different language, we don't do it the same way. Instead, we map a property with a value using the colon syntax. And so in this case, what we're saying is that the color should be blue. And then we follow that with a semicolon. So we're kind of doing a similar thing with the way the attribute works in HTML to do properties and values in CSS, but the syntax is different. When we have those properties and values, they get applied to this target. The H1 is the target of this CSS rule. And that means that this tag, this target, H1, will be colored blue, as will all its children, anything contained within the H1 tags. When we consider an internal style sheet, we have the same structure of the language with an important difference. We still have a property, that's color. We still have a value, that's blue. You can see that we've specified it here with something called a selector. When we move to an internal style sheet and we add a selector to our specification, we're no longer indicating that only one tag should have this style applied to it. Now what we're saying is that any H1 tag in this document will have this style applied to it. Now in this particular example, the selector is only selecting one target. There's only one H1 tag in this document, and so it will only be applied to that one H1 tag. But if there were others, the style would apply to those other H1 tags as well. So in addition to a property and a value and a target, in an internal style sheet, we add a selector as well. That's the H1 in this style block. Our external style sheet looks exactly like the internal style sheet, except that we add this remote style sheet inclusion line, starting with the HTML tag link, which has the IRI of where we find this particular file, style.css. It will be located in the same location, protocol, hostname, file path, as the file that this link is in. And then in the remote file, we use the same language. In style.css, we have a selector, we have a property, color, and we have a value, blue. And what this means is that all of the H1 tags that are present in the HTML file that links to the external style sheet will have that property assigned. Now it's possible that we could have multiple properties assigned besides just color and blue, and all of those properties would be applied to the H1 tag. But in this particular case, we're only applying one particular property and value pair to all of the H1 tags that are present within the lower HTML document. Here's the target. It's the same target as we had in the internal style sheet. Just notice that the selector is in one file and the target is in a second file. And the way we marry those two things together is by using the link tag in the head of the HTML. So very common uses of CSS are to do things like to manage color, font, and borders. Also layout. There are a lot of different ways in which CSS is used. We've just seen an example of coloring text blue. Let's expand and make our examples of CSS a little bit more complex and see what else we can do with it. In this case, I've modified our HTML so that we can see multiple examples of the same tag. In this case, we have our HTML document in the upper left. The head has a title, sample. It has a link to an external style sheet called style.css. And that contents of that style CSS file are located in the upper right, above me somewhere. The type attribute and the rel attribute, they're boilerplate. It's almost, I don't know that I've ever seen them be anything different when you're referencing an external style sheet. It's always text/CSS, and rel is always style sheet. Now what's different here in the body is that we've added two h1 tags. We have one h1 tag that says this is a heading, and we have a second h1 tag that says this is another heading. And then we have a third tag, which is the p, this is a paragraph tag. So over in our style sheet, when we use a selector of h1, our target becomes both of those h1 tags in our HTML file. And you can see that in our external style sheet, not only are we coloring our headline, our h1 lines blue, but we're also saying that we should apply the font family courier to that text, and we should make the font size 300%, 3 times its normal size. So down below, you can see that the first h1 tag has that style applied, but also the second h1 tag has that style applied. You can see that the following tag, the p tag, it doesn't have that style applied. It's not selected. It's not the target of the selector, at least the h1 selector. Instead, our external style sheet has a second selector. This selector is the p tag. So let's look a little bit at the structure of our CSS file here. You can see that each of our selectors starts its own line. It's followed by curly brackets, and within those curly brackets we have any property value pairs that we want applied to our targets. Each one of the property and value pairs are connected with a colon, and each line has to end with a semicolon. These are the details of how the cascading style sheet language is laid out. You can see that at the end of the h1 style rules is a closing curly bracket. It doesn't have a semicolon after it, that's notable. And then for convenience, we put a space between the h1 and the p tag. That's not necessary, but that's helpful for human readability. Likewise, the indentation of color, font family, and font size, that's convenient for readability, but that's not part of the language. In our second tag here, our second selector, our p selector, we use the same syntax. Open curly bracket, close curly bracket. Property value, property value, property value. Each one of those property value pairs ended with a semicolon. Well, that p selector, that then targets the p tag in our document. And you can see that the styling is different. We've given it a red font color. The font family is Verdana, and then the font size is 150%, what its normal default font size would be. Half of the h1 tag in this case. Another common use of CSS is to apply borders to different regions. So for that, we're going to use a completely different set of property and value pairs. We've kept the HTML the same in the upper left in this document, and we've added just one more property value pair to our P selector in the external style sheet. You can see that we've given the property border, we've added that, and we've put on the right the value, or actually kind of 3 different values. It's 2 pixels, which indicates how wide the border should be. It's solid, indicating that it should be a solid line, not dashed or anything else. And it's green, indicating a color. And then finally, we end with a semicolon. That then gets applied to our paragraph tag down here, and you can see we have a border applied. You can also see why I'm not a graphic designer. I'm more of a programmer. Now, you might ask, hey, where are all these properties and values coming from? Well, all those properties, there are lots and lots of properties and values. All the different kinds of things that you associate with graphic design, maybe with word processor formatting. You can specify fonts and superscripts. You can specify borders, and you can specify text wrapping. You can specify shadows. You can specify background images. You can specify background colors. Kind of all manner of different things are possible in specifying how something should be laid out. You don't memorize them. Typically, if you're writing this kind of style sheet, what you're going to do is you're going to look up what you need to know in a document, in an external, and in the definition of how the cascading style sheets are specified. And as you get more familiar with it, as you write more, as you work more with it, you'll remember them and it'll become second nature. Likewise, what values these things can take on are defined as well. So what colors can you specify? Well, blue is a predefined color, but you can also specify any RGB color as well as colors in a variety of different formats. What fonts are available? Well, that's worth a whole nother lecture that I'll probably put together later. So CSS overall is a language, and it's a language that does two things. It selects locations in an HTML document. Now, you may not have thought of this, but as HTML is a tree-structured document, what CSS selectors are doing is they're identifying portions in your HTML tree to which a style should be applied. Now, the style sheet can select any tag in your document. It can select H1 or P tags, as we've seen, but it can also select an anchor tag. It can select, I don't know, whatever tag you can think of. It can select the body tag even. That's one part of the CSS language, the selector part of the language. The other part of the language is the property value pairs. This is what format you want to apply to all of the nodes that match the selector. Oh, also all of its children. That's why it has the name Cascading Style Sheet, because the style cascades down into all of the children in the HTML document that you apply the style to. So, for example, if you select the body tag and you apply a style to the body tag, well, everything in your document will have that style applied to it, because the body tag is the root of all of the content of your document. There are a lot of different ways that you can select locations in your HTML document, and we'll look at that in more depth in a future lecture. But just to kind of explore some of that, you can see here in the white box in the center, what I've done is I've selected 3 different separate tags to apply a particular style to. So in this case, the way you read that is that any H2 tag in your document, or any H3 tag in your document, or any A tag or anchor tag in your document should all have the font size 200% applied to it. Now, I could have listed these 3 separately. I could have said H2 font size 200, and H3 font size 200, and A font size 200. But for convenience, as a shortcut, you could also put them together as long as you separate them with a comma. If you don't separate them with a comma, it means something different. We'll explore that in a future lecture. Now, you don't run into this very often, but I have mentioned that there are several different ways of specifying CSS rules, inline, internal, and external. And you can imagine that in a large project, you might have conflicting style rules. When you mix these conflicting cascading style selector rules, you kind of get into a little bit of a mess of trying to understand what style is being applied. Nevertheless, there are rules that you follow. If you just use an external style sheet, it's much easier to resolve this. But sometimes you don't have that ability and you have to resolve some of these rules. So you can think about this generally in a principle of moving from farthest away to closest in. And if you think about the browser default as being the farthest away, that's what you start from. So the browser has a particular styling that it comes with. So usually the text is Times New Roman. Sometimes these default style rules can be changed for accessibility reasons or other reasons. But generally speaking, without any style, you get a default kind of HTML presentation. Now that default presentation can get overridden by any rules that are present in an external style sheet. So moving from farthest away to a little bit closer in, the external style sheet. Any new rules that you have about fonts or colors are going to override the default. As you move closer into your document and you encounter rules that are present in the internal style sheet, those internal style sheet rules located in the head of your HTML will override any similar rules that are present in your external style sheet or in your browser default. Finally, as you move closest to the data, as you look at inline style attributes with styles applied to single tags, those are going to override internal styling, external styling, and browser defaults. So you kind of have this other way in which styles are cascading down into the content. That's one way of thinking about conflicting rules, is distance. But you can also there's also ways in which you could have conflicting rules where your selector maybe selects the same thing. And we haven't really talked about how you can have more specific rules in selectors yet. But more specific rules are going to take precedence over less specific rules, meaning that selector tag. And then the third thing you have to be aware of is later rules take precedence over earlier rules. So for a simple example, imagine in your external style sheet you had styling for the H1 tag at two different places within your external style sheet. Probably a mistake, but nevertheless, the way that gets resolved is you can imagine the browser reading through your document from top to bottom. It first reads the first H1 rule, and then as it gets to the bottom, it reads the second H1 rule, and the bottom one, the later one, overwrites any of the rules of the previous one. So three different ways in which we need to be aware, three different things that we have to be aware of in order to resolve conflicting cascading style sheet rules: proximity, specificity, and temporality, I guess, later in the document. With many of the languages that you use, there are tools to help you make sure you're writing it in a well-formed manner. CSS is no different. If you search the web for an online CSS lint tool, you will encounter them. Here's one that's put together by the W3C, the organization that originally specified the cascading style sheet syntax. There are three different ways if you use this lint tool that you can specify how you want your CSS communicated to the tool. You can do it by URI, basically a URL or an IRI. Meaning specifying that, and then the tool will go out and get it and bring it in. Or you can upload a file, or you can cut and paste it. That's direct input. And that's what I've done here. I've cut and pasted a particular CSS, external style sheet CSS rules, and put it in here to see if I have good format. What does that mean? Well, are my selectors well formed? Do I have appropriate curly braces? Have I ended things with semicolons? Am I using known properties? Am I using well-formed values? All of those things will be validated by a service like this. I click check, and then I'll get feedback about how it went. In this case, there were no errors, and so that's really, that's good. That means that my browser won't have to guess about what I meant. If there were errors, there'd be specifications about what line and what the nature of the error was returned to me. So to summarize, cascading style sheets, which we abbreviate as CSS, are rules that are used to format or style the aesthetics of an HTML document. The HTML document is focused on the content of your document, but CSS is focused on the presentation or aesthetics of that document. CSS itself is a language that identifies parts of the HTML tree. That's the first thing it does. And the second thing it does is it describes how those parts should look. This is the basis for getting a web application or a website up and running. HTML, CSS, and then eventually JavaScript. As you read CSS selectors, you're going to find that they're used in a lot of different places besides just cascading style sheets. So learning the language of CSS is a great skill to have in the process of developing a website or becoming more familiar with the language of the web. Thank you for your attention.